Hello, my name is Sean Greenheld, and this lecture recital will explore Clara Schumann's influence on the composition of Robert Schumann's Fantasy in C major, Opus 17. I'll begin with discussing the work's origins, where we'll mention Beethoven's influence, and then swiftly move on to explore the many ways Clara influenced the work, referencing their relationship, the themes and the character of the fantasy, and the revisions Robert made in the work. Much of the analysis centres around the first movement of the fantasy, and now become clear as to why. Schumann took great interest in the creation of the Beethoven Monument, which celebrated the life and achievements of the recently deceased composer. Many musicians supported this memorial, including Mendelssohn, who composes variation serios in D minor, and Liszt was the largest financial benefactor of the project. In 1836, Schumann wrote a letter to Friedrich Kistner, persuading him to publish the fantasy for Beethoven's monument, stating that all the earnings from the sales would be donated to fund the project. The work was titled Ruins, Trophies, Palms, Grand Piano Sonata for Beethoven's Monument. Rosansky claims that the title is a programmatic reference to the different periods and stages of Beethoven's life. Schumann was very fond of Beethoven. He wrote, "Beethoven I worship like a god." In particular, Schumann admired Beethoven's light style. "He and only the very best excites me. Beethoven mostly in his later works." There are parallels to be found between Beethoven's late sonatas and Schumann's fantasy. Most notable are the obsessive and persistent use of continuous dotted rhythms. This is the case for the second movement march of the fantasy, which is similar to Beethoven's Opus 101 march, and the second movement of Opus 111. However, Schumann's proposal for the Beethoven Monument was rejected by the publishers. Publishers tended to approach Schumann's works with caution due to their new and eccentric features, claims John de Veria. Indeed, the fantasy is very eccentric in nature, and that is a topic that we'll explore further later in the Research Lecture Recital. As a result, the title of the work went through a couple of changes as it was no longer needed for the Beethoven Monument. In April 1838, Schumann titled it Ruins, Triumphal Arch, Constellation and Poems, before the title finally became Fantasy in 3 Movements by December 1838. Although the titles changed, the influence of Beethoven remains very much in the score. Schumann revealed one quotation in his proposal letter to Kistner, stating that there is a quotation from the Allegretto of Beethoven's A major symphony. In the third movement of the fantasy we hear this. This is the melody from the symphony. And this is the melody from the fantasy. This quotation is used in passing and doesn't play a significant role in the third movement or the work as a whole. Whereas Schumann's quotation from the 6th movement of Beethoven's An die Ferne geliebt this can be seen as the principal theme in the first movement of the fantasy, claims de Veria. Here it is in the fantasy. Why did this theme play such an important role in the first movement? From all of Beethoven's music, which Schumann was fond, what inspired him about this passage in particular? An attempt to answer this requires exploration of the influence of Clara Schumann, who was Clara Wieck at the time. Inouye claims that, yes, the Beethoven quote in particular, An die Ferne geliebt, was used to pay homage to Beethoven, but they were also a declaration of love and a message to Clara. To explore Clara's influence, it is important to have a brief understanding of the background to their relationship and what state it was in at the time the work was composed. In 1830, Robert decided to pursue a career in music as opposed to law. He became a piano student of Friedrich Wieck, who was Clara's father. Over the years, their friendship became increasingly intense. Clara stated in her journal, Robert stimulated her most noble and artistic qualities, They would improvise, share memories and experiences, and fantasize about what music they would write together. In 1833, Clara dedicated her Romances Varie, Opus 3, to Robert. By 1836, their relationship was much more intimate and codependent. In February, Robert wrote to Clara, "Your radiant image shines through the darkness and helps me to bear everything better. I am quite clear about my heart. Perhaps your father will not refuse if I ask him for his blessing." Unfortunately for Robert, Frederick refused his proposal for various reasons, and he did his utmost to completely cut off Robert and Clara's relationship. For a year and a half, they did not see each other and they rarely communicated. The separation from Clara, occurring in 1836, triggered real emotional turmoil for Robert. He apologises for not responding to his friends' letters. For example, Anton von Zuckelmaglio, explaining the reason he hadn't replied is because he was suffering from deep emotional pain. During this experience, Schumann channeled his emotions into the composition of the fantasy. Schumann wrote to Clara in 1838, "The first movement is probably the most passionate thing I've ever written, a deep lament for you." Interestingly, Clara was more impressed and spoke more frequently about the second movement march. She wrote to him, "I always play the fantasy with true rapture, with truly inner delight. The march, Robert, is really sublime." Dismissing much of Clara's commentary of the second movement, Robert was keen to explore her thoughts about the first movement. He wrote to Clara, "Does it conjure up many images for you? I like the melody," in bars 95-7, "best of all." Using these biographical findings, we can support Inouye's claim that the Andifen Geliebt quotation was a declaration of love to Clara. Although there's no evidence of Schumann stating that he had quoted Beethoven's song cycle, Marston claims that he is likely to have been aware of the origins of the phrase in the Beethoven song cycle. The subject of Andifen Geliebt is the distant beloved. The parallels are clearly evident, as Schumann stated that the first movement was a deep lament for Clara, whom he was separated at the time. Furthermore, the text of the phrase that Schumann used is "take them then these songs." The writer of the text, Alois Jetels, stated that by singing the songs, the distance of the beloved will be lessened. It is evident that Robert and Clara resonated with this ideal. Referencing Kinterzenen Opus 15, Clara wrote to Robert, "They belong only to the both of us. They are always on my mind, and they are so like you." And this drew them closer together even though they were physically apart. Not only did Robert's emotional turmoil from his separation with Clara influence his use of the Beethoven quote, it greatly influenced the character of the work overall. Friedrich Schlegel, a leading figure in early Romanticism, defined Romanticism as literature depicting emotional matter in an imaginative form. Similarly, Schumann believed that the only purpose of writing music was to reveal the composer's inner state of mind. Schumann respected Schlegel and took much inspiration from his texts, so much so that he prefaced the fantasy with a quote from him. Regarding the imaginative form of Schlegel's definition of Romanticism, the form of the fantasy's first movement has been disputed throughout its history. Some critics, such as Wasilewski, believe that the first movement is unmistakably that of sonata form. Marsden claims that there are some principles of sonata operative in the movement, although to an extent which resists precise definition. The lack of common consensus regarding the form of the first movement could act as evidence for an imaginative form, as it can't be clearly defined. Let's look at some examples of how Robert's emotional turmoil from his separation with Clara manifests itself in the work. One of the first things the listener notices in the first movement is its frequent abrupt changes without preparation. I will play a few examples from the first movement highlighting this. Here, the music loses its sense of direction and momentum before suddenly exploding back to life with full passion. The syncopation, accents, dotted rhythms, and fortissimo create a sense of agitation and urgency. Following on from this, the music remains fierce, and the syncopation from bar 28 that we just heard has become a feature of the melody, with strong, almost violent chords. Then, unexpectedly, we encounter an intensely lyrical and drifting melody. It has an ethereal quality due to the melody being carried in 3 octaves. Interestingly, aged 20, Schumann invented 2 companions to comfort himself during times of stress, namely Florestan and Eusebius. Psychiatrist and concert pianist Richard Kogan claims that the character portrayals envelope aspects of Schumann's personality and compositional style. Eusebius is a melancholic dreamer. He's meditative in nature and poetic. He is often viewed as Schumann's depressed self. On the other hand, Florestan is often viewed as Schumann's manic self, an impetuous, frenetic individual who is extremely passionate, which borderlines aggressive. As for the frequent changes between these characters in the work, Kogan suggests that Robert's thought process was fragmented at the time of composition due to the stress of separation from Clara. He claims that associations and memories can flood in from anywhere, and Robert was manifesting this in his work. Although amongst the frequent abrupt changes, there are rare moments where Schumann stays with a particular character for an extended period of time. Here, Eusebius is left uninterrupted by Florestan to speak freely, resulting in a notably beautiful passage in the first movement. Of course, Florestan is never too far away, and when he returns, its impetuous and passionate qualities are evident. Furthermore, the music has a certain longing quality, perhaps stemming from his longing from Clara. Schumann claimed, "Everything that happens in the world has its effect on me. Politics, literature, people. In my own way, I reflect on it all and then have to give vent to it through the outlet of music." Here, the first note of each phrase is placed before the bar line, often tying to the downbeat. I argue that this creates a feeling of reaching forward, trying to grab something. Interestingly, this effect is heard more clearly if I play an example where the phrases begin on the downbeat. This sounds orderly, stable, and classical in style, actually. Now the written version, and notice the effect of longing and reaching. After these upbeats, the phrase descends, which could signify Schumann's failing attempt of reaching for Clara. All of this is heightened by the bubbling, vibrational quality of the left-hand accompaniment figure. Schumann wrote, "I have nothing but one thought to depict everywhere in letters and chords. Clara." Robert Schaufler stated that all the sonatas and fantasy are bound together in a large unity by the consistent use of a single source motif: C, B flat, A flat, G, F. In a letter, Clara claimed this theme as her own. She composed it, and Robert was using it with this knowledge. She revealed this to Robert in a letter regarding the variations in his third piano sonata in F minor. Through analysis of this theme and the other themes used in the first movement, we can see how Clara pervades all the music. Although in a different key, the stepwise descending fifth, the characteristic feature of Clara's theme, is here the first theme of the whole piece. Even at the accompaniment level, the theme is present, which sets up the right hand. The next phrase contains the same theme, starting on the note higher, but now it's piano from fortissimo, another example of the piece's unexpected contrasts. Thinning the texture in comparison to the opening statements, Robert applies rhythmic diminution to the theme, and here the intervals have been expanded from seconds to thirds, but the overall contour of the phrase is the same. Then there is another passionate statement of the Clara theme in the right hand, and interestingly, the left-hand bass notes and harmony outlines the descending fifth theme. The opening G dominant pedal is largely maintained from the beginning all the way to bar 28, before stepwise moving down to C. Also, the theme is heard in its inversion, highlighted with accents. Here, the full version of the opening theme to the movement is stated in retrograde in the upper voice and inverted retrograde in the two lower voices. The next theme to be discussed first occurs in bar 41. When exploring the unexpected contrasts of the work, we commented on this lyrical nature of the melody. Sams's theory of the Schumann ciphers compiles a large list of hidden messages from a wide range of Robert's works. As can be seen here, the Clara theme is present with P and its inversion Q. Interestingly, the X phrase found in bar 41, shown in Sams's 13th example, is used frequently and almost exclusively in Robert's vocal works after the fantasy was composed, including Liederkreis, Mithrin and Dictolieb. This version of the Clara theme can be found in fragments here and parts of a circle of fifths. Once again, Schumann appears to outline the theme with the bass notes G, C, B flat, A, thus highlighting the fragment which is being explored in the right hand. This takes us to the An die Fern geliebt theme, which concludes the movement. Interestingly, these three themes are very similar in nature, in terms of the descending movement, use of the appoggiaturas and rhythm, and they all have ties to Clara. However, there is one contrasting theme, which occurs in the I'm Legend section, with its rising contour and lack of stepwise movement. Its first utterances are in bar 34. Then the theme is explored in full in the I'm Legend section, in a theme and variation-like style. Sam's alluded to the possibility that this theme's secret message could be Robert, his own name. Using the cipher wheel system, it gives to more arpeggiated figures, such as in this theme. Interestingly, Clara's stepwise fifth theme is present here as well, sometimes found in the bass, the counter melody, and the melody itself. Often the greatest challenge a composer faces is how to conclude their work, especially with such a large and complex piece such as Schumann's Fantasy. Should the piece end triumphantly or peacefully? Should the ending overcome the struggles apparent within the work or leave them unresolved? Looking at the composer's sketches and manuscripts can provide great insight into the composer's creative process of working through these problems in their work. By looking at these early sources, we can see that they can change their mind. A great example of this is in Liszt's Grand B minor Sonata, where he initially composed an ending with the full force of the piano to create a powerful climax to the work, only to completely change his mind and compose an ending with triple pianissimo chords, only in the upper register of the piano. There is an interesting link between the Liszt B minor Sonata and Schumann's Fantasy, and it's that they're dedicated to each other. They were both very fond and very proud of these dedications, as they are regarded as some of the composer's finest works. Interestingly, Robert made a significant alteration to the coda in the final movement of the Fantasy when he was revising the work for publication in 1839, 3 years after he initially composed the piece in 1836. This is the last page of the Fantasy. We can see that Schumann clearly crossed out the ending that he wrote in 1836 and had rewritten the ending of the work, and we are familiar with this version. The source is located in the Székely Library in Budapest and was written by Karl Bruckner, who was copying the work from Schumann's autograph for Robert to revise. The source can be of great use to performers and listeners alike. The goal of my analysis into both endings is not to determine which ending should be used in performance, as Schumann made his intentions very clear by crossing it out. Although interestingly, some pianists have chosen to perform the original crossed out ending, most notably Andras Schiff at the Wigmore Hall in October 2020. But through comparison and analysis of both the endings in terms of its musical content and emotional impact, we can bring greater clarity to our understanding of the work as a whole. I argue that it is likely that Robert's changed emotional perspective regarding Clara 3 years later on has initiated the alteration. Interestingly, the coda that Schumann wrote in his pre-revised version on the left of the screen has many striking similarities to the coda from the first movement, which is on the right of the screen. As can be seen from first glance, the overall phrase structure is the same. The melodic contour is preserved, and the melodic fragments are punctuated by chordal passages before closing with the repeated tonic chords. The only differences become apparent when we look in more detail at the notes. For example, Schumann has inverted the D sharp and F sharp, and now they slide down a semitone rather than moving up a semitone to the 6/4 chord. As a result, we have a D minor 7 chord, which begins a series of strong 2-5-1 cadences all the way to the end of the piece. In the coda of the first movement, we have a 6-4-5-1 cadence. Furthermore, the melody has slightly changed to accommodate the change in harmony. We have an F after the C. So this has changed from a perfect fourth to a perfect fifth. Aha, the presence of Clara is here, maybe. This is significant because this is the Andy Fern Geliebt theme, which we know has strong ties to Clara, but now this theme is even more personal and intimate. Due to the changed melody and harmony, the music sounds even more longing, almost like it's a final cry or a plea for Clara. This ending appears suitable. It is in keeping with the theme of Clara, and it circles back to the first movement. So why did Schumann scrap this ending for a new one in 1839? We can theorise that it was due to his change in emotional perspective from 1839 from 1836. From a series of letters that he wrote to Clara, for example in 1838, he wrote, "You can understand the fantasy if you go back to the unhappy summer of 1836 when we were separated." In 1839, Schumann stated that the fantasy was stylistically backward and immature. He called it out of date, as the emotional upheaval from the summer of 1836 was a thing of the past. Therefore, Schumann may have thought that the return to the excessive longing for Clara was not needed, and it wasn't appropriate anymore. Maybe it was a harsh reminder of the past, which he wanted to avoid. Further evidence for this claim is that the revised ending is much more plain than the ending Schumann originally composed. There's a huge difference between the two, the only similarity being the voicing of the final chords and the powerful climax of the previous phrase. The music continues with the same rhythm, with the momentum gradually dissipating to a very simple plagal cadence at the end. The ending is noble and peaceful. It can be argued that Schumann changed the ending for different reasons, such as the impact of the finale would have been weakened by the new and distinctive idea of the Andy Fern Geliebt quote. Maybe he thought against using it because the idea was too repetitive or worn out. However, I argue that the lack of any thematic connection to Clara in the finale speaks volumes, thus highlighting how Schumann's pain and suffering had gone. Lastly, in 1839, Schumann wrote in a letter to Clara, "Now I have no reason to compose such unhappy and melancholy music." To conclude, Clara had a significant influence on the composition of Robert Schumann's fantasy. Not only was Robert paying homage to Beethoven when quoting Andy Fern Geliebt, he was declaring his love for Clara. In keeping with the Romantic tradition, Schumann's work is almost autobiographical, as he is processing his emotions regarding his separation from Clara in 1836 through the music. Clara's self-composed theme plays an elaborate role in much of the thematic material of the first movement. And finally, Robert changed the ending of the third movement due to his changed feelings for Clara in 1839. This is such a glorious work. The more one becomes absorbed in its history, notably Clara's influence, the more one can appreciate its genius. To finish this lecture recital, I'd like to share a sentiment from Braunschweig. The fantasy outwardly contains Clara's melodies and ciphers, and inwardly Robert's thoughts and dreams. This is a beautiful phrase, and it's so true for the fantasy and much of Schumann's work composed at this time.